Welcome to Truth Behind History, and here is a question that sounds simple until you actually follow the money. When you buy a coffee, who set that price, really? Was it local demand, a bad harvest somewhere, or something much quieter and more powerful that most people never see? By the end of this video, you are going to understand why coffee feels like a personal daily habit, yet its price is often anchored to a global reference system that moves across borders faster than the beans ever could, and why that can create a strange disconnect between what you pay at a cafe and what the people growing the coffee actually receive. Now, let's start with the puzzle itself. Coffee is one of those products that lives in two worlds at once. In your world, it is a warm cup, a routine, maybe even a small luxury. In the producer's world, it is a harvest that depends on weather, timing, labor, transportation, and often a lot of uncertainty. But in the global market, coffee is treated like a standardized commodity with a reference price, a benchmark, that becomes the gravitational center for deals around the world. That means the price is not only responding to a farmer's local supply and demand. It is also responding to a global signal that many contracts are built around. So here is the key idea on this slide. There is a difference between the retail price you see and the farm gate reality producers live with, and those two can move in very different ways. Retail prices often feel smoother. They change slowly because cafes and brands have wages, rent, marketing, and other costs that do not jump every day. But the global benchmark price for green coffee can swing sharply because it reflects a world full of uncertainty, expectations, and financial pressure. So you can get this strange outcome where the cafe price climbs steadily over time while the benchmark price whips around, and the farmer's share can feel like it is on a roller coaster. And this is where a lot of confusion comes from, because people assume, naturally, that if coffee is more expensive at the cafe, the farmer must be earning more. Sometimes that happens, but it is not guaranteed, because farm gate pricing is often tied to a benchmark minus adjustments that reflect everything from quality and origin to shipping and timing. So the puzzle we are putting on the table is not just why does coffee cost what it costs, but why does the price system produce so much volatility for the people closest to the ground? If coffee is a global commodity, then the price travels globally. But if you are a farmer, your costs are local, your risks are local, and your ability to absorb swings is limited. So as we move forward, keep this simple question in mind. If the world has built a single reference signal that shapes coffee deals everywhere, what does that do to the balance of power and the distribution of risk across the supply chain? That question is the doorway into everything else. On this slide, we are going to open up the mechanism that turns coffee from a physical crop into a globally coordinated price, and it starts with a deceptively simple idea: benchmarks. In many commodity markets, coffee included, buyers and sellers do not renegotiate the entire price from scratch every time a shipment moves. Instead, they anchor deals to a widely recognized reference price, a benchmark, and then they adjust from there based on the real-world specifics of the coffee in front of them. So think of the benchmark as the market's common language. It is not saying every coffee is identical. It is saying, here is the central reference price we all recognize, and now we will translate your actual coffee into that language. That translation happens through what the industry calls differentials, which are simply additions or subtractions that reflect factors like quality, origin, processing method, reliability of delivery, and the timing and terms of the contract. In other words, you can imagine a basic sentence that many contracts are built around: benchmark plus differential equals contract price. That one structure is doing an enormous amount of work. It reduces bargaining costs, because you are not debating the entire universe every time, and it makes trade scalable across borders because everyone can point to the same reference and then negotiate the adjustments. But it also has a deeper consequence that is easy to miss. The benchmark becomes the anchor for negotiations, even when the coffee being sold is not the standardized grade that the benchmark is designed around. For example, coffees like Arabica and Robusta can be connected to different reference prices, and yet the coffee grown in a specific region, on specific terrain, with specific quality traits, is still often priced as an adjustment off a central signal rather than priced purely on its own local conditions. This is where the power of the system shows up. When a benchmark is the anchor, it starts to function like gravity. Even if a producer's local situation is improving or worsening, the starting point for the conversation is often the benchmark, and then the producer must argue for a better differential. And that matters because differentials are not just about taste or reputation. They also reflect bargaining power, access to buyers, and the ability to meet contract requirements consistently. So when you hear people talk about the coffee price, it is usually not one single thing. It is a benchmark price that is widely visible and widely referenced, plus a set of adjustments that can be very different depending on who is negotiating, what is being shipped, and how much leverage each side has. And if you are wondering why this matters for everyday life, it is because benchmarks compress a planet's worth of local coffees into a single reference point, and then the real-world human story lives inside the differentials. If you want to understand why coffee prices today can feel like they come from a distant control room, you have to go back to the moment when trade stopped being just a handshake over physical goods and became a system built to tame uncertainty. Futures markets did not begin as a modern finance game. They emerged because merchants and producers faced a brutal problem that never really went away. Harvests are unpredictable, shipments take time, and prices can change between the moment you plant and the moment you deliver. So people developed a tool that let them agree on terms ahead of time, not because they loved abstraction, but because they needed stability to plan. Now, the exact origins and the first true futures contract are debated depending on how strictly you define the term, but the broad story is consistent across economic history. Organized trading venues gradually built standardized contracts to make long-distance commerce scalable. And here is the crucial shift. Once you standardize a contract, you are not just trading coffee or grain or any crop as a unique local product. You are trading a defined unit with defined rules, meaning a market can form around it, liquidity can concentrate, and prices can be quoted in a way that thousands of people can reference at the same time. That standardization is an efficiency miracle because it lowers negotiation costs and makes trade faster and broader. But it also carries a quiet consequence: it creates a price center. When everyone uses the same standardized reference, the market begins to orbit around that reference. Local realities still matter, of course, but the common price signal becomes the starting point for how value is discussed. So futures trading, developed over roughly 3 centuries as markets modernized, did more than create a new contract type. It changed how societies coordinate economic life across distance. It turned uncertainty into something that could be priced, traded, and managed through a central reference system. And once you see that, the coffee market stops looking like a simple story of farmers and drinkers. It becomes a story about how an innovation designed to handle risk and time also built a powerful, standardized language for pricing that could eventually dominate how the world talks about a humble bean. Let's get practical now, because futures can sound mysterious until you break it into plain language. A coffee futures contract is, at its core, a standardized agreement tied to coffee that is designed to be tradable. The reason it matters is that it lets people deal with price risk before the physical coffee is actually bought or sold in the everyday sense. And that is the first concept to keep on this slide. Futures markets move information and expectations into the price very quickly, often faster than the physical market can react. Now, who uses these contracts and why? One group is hedgers. These are participants in the real coffee business who want to reduce uncertainty. If you are involved in producing, exporting, or roasting coffee, price swings can help you one month and crush you the next. Hedging is a way to lock in, or at least stabilize, the price you will effectively receive or pay, so you can plan. Another group is speculators. Their role is not necessarily to touch coffee at all. They take on price risk in exchange for the chance to profit, and by doing that they add liquidity, which makes it easier for hedgers to enter and exit positions. That is why you will often hear that speculators provide liquidity, even though their presence can also make short-term moves sharper when a lot of money shifts in or out quickly. Now we have to talk about margin and leverage, because this is where futures feel very different from ordinary buying and selling. In futures markets, you do not typically pay the full value of the contract upfront. You post margin, which is a kind of performance bond, and that means relatively small moves in price can have a big impact on your position. This is why futures prices can react dramatically to new information or to changes in market mood, because the system is built for rapid repricing and constant accounting of gains and losses. Another key concept on this slide is that the futures price and the spot price are linked over time, even if they do not match perfectly every moment. Markets are designed so that, as a contract approaches its defined delivery period, the futures price tends to line up more closely with the real-world spot conditions for the standardized contract terms. But day to day, the futures price is heavily influenced by expectations, risk appetite, and the flow of positions, not just by whether trucks are moving coffee at that exact hour. So when people say, why did coffee prices jump if the coffee is still on the trees? The answer is that futures markets are pricing what the world thinks the future will look like and how much risk people are willing to carry right now. And once you grasp hedging, speculation, margin, and this expectation-driven pricing, you can see how a financial instrument can shape the benchmark that physical coffee contracts reference, even before a single bag changes hands in the way most consumers imagine. Now that you have a clear picture of how futures contracts function, we can ask the deeper question this slide is built around: are these markets mainly doing price discovery, or are they creating price power? Price discovery is the idea that a market price becomes an information machine. It pulls in signals from many directions, like weather risk, shipping constraints, inventories, currency moves, and interest rate conditions, and it compresses all of that into a single number that people can reference. In that sense, a benchmark price can be incredibly useful because it coordinates a vast global trade without requiring every buyer and seller to negotiate from zero. It is a shared language, and shared languages lower friction. But here is where the tension begins. The very thing that makes benchmarks efficient also makes them centralizing. When liquidity concentrates in one benchmark, that benchmark starts to function like the pricing authority, not because someone declared it so, but because so many contracts, negotiations, and expectations point to it. That can create a situation where the benchmark becomes less like a neutral thermometer and more like the anchor that pulls the entire physical market toward it. And once that happens, you have to notice a subtle but important possibility. The benchmark can move because of financial flows and positioning, not only because of immediate changes in physical coffee conditions. That does not mean the price is fake. It means the price reflects what the most active part of the market is processing in real time, including risk appetite and uncertainty. Some economists and market participants argue that this improves efficiency because it makes prices respond quickly to information and allows risk to be transferred smoothly. Others argue that it can amplify short-run swings, especially when large pools of capital enter or exit rapidly, and that the benchmark's central role can overshadow local bargaining realities. The honest point, and the one you should carry from this slide, is that the benchmark is both a tool and a force. It discovers prices by aggregating information, but it can also concentrate price formation in a way that shapes who negotiates from strength and who negotiates from dependence. So when you hear one global price quoted as if it is the price of coffee everywhere, it is worth asking, is that number simply reflecting the world, or is it also reorganizing the world by becoming the reference that everyone must live with? This slide is where we say something that sounds obvious but is often forgotten the moment people hear the word hedging. Risk does not vanish. It moves. Futures markets, at their core, are systems for transferring price risk from one set of hands to another. They can reduce uncertainty for a hedger, but the uncertainty still exists in the world, and someone is still carrying it. So the real question becomes, who is structurally positioned to shed risk, and who is structurally positioned to absorb it? In coffee, the answer is often uncomfortable because the participants closest to the crop frequently face the hardest mix of risks. Producers deal with weather, pests, timing, labor conditions, and local infrastructure constraints, and these are risks you cannot simply outsmart with a spreadsheet. Meanwhile, larger buyers and firms often have more tools, bigger balance sheets, easier access to credit, dedicated expertise, and the ability to spread risk across many contracts and many origins. So hedging can be easier to use effectively at scale. That does not make it immoral or evil, it just means it is uneven. And when a tool is unevenly accessible, the market's volatility starts to behave like a pressure that pushes hardest on the smallest participants. Here is another key point on this slide: hedging itself can have costs and barriers. You need access to financial services. You need knowledge. You may need collateral. You need to manage positions and timing. If you are a small producer or a small cooperative, those hurdles can be real, and in some regions they are the difference between participating and being priced as a passive recipient of whatever the benchmark says. So the unintended consequence is not that futures exist, but that the ability to use them is not distributed evenly. Volatility can become something like a tax on those with the least cushion. When prices fall, the shock hits income. When prices rise, the relief can be limited by debt obligations, contract structures, and the time lag between market movements and the moment coffee is actually sold. So the big takeaway is simple: futures markets can stabilize planning for some participants, but they also reveal and reinforce the unequal capacity to manage uncertainty. When you look at the coffee price story through this lens, you stop asking only, is the price right? And you start asking, who is being asked to carry the risk while everyone else enjoys the stability that risk management tools provide? Now we zoom out from risk and look at something most people assume they already understand, but usually do not. Where does your coffee dollar actually go? When you hand over money at a cafe, it feels like you are paying for coffee. In reality, you are paying for an entire chain of costs and value-added steps, and the bin itself is only one part of that final price. On this slide, the key is to separate two ideas that are constantly blurred together. One is the consumer price, what you pay at retail. The other is the green coffee price, which is tied to a benchmark plus adjustments and is only one slice of the final cup. Retail prices include things like rent, wages, equipment, marketing, waste, and the cost of running a business in a specific place. Those costs can be relatively steady or rise gradually, which helps explain why cafe prices often look smooth over time. Green coffee prices, by contrast, can be volatile, and even when they move, that movement does not automatically flow to the farmer as higher income. Why? Because the producer's reality is shaped not just by the benchmark but by the terms of the deal, the differential, the timing, and local conditions like financing costs and currency conversion. This is why the phrase "coffee prices are up" can be misleading. It might be true at the benchmark level, but a farmer can still be squeezed if input costs rise, if debt payments are fixed, if the differential is unfavorable, or if the local currency shifts. And here is a point that consumers often find surprising: even when the benchmark rises, the share of the final cup represented by green coffee can shrink in relative terms if other parts of the chain have higher costs or stronger pricing power. So when people say, if coffee is expensive now, producers must be doing great, the honest answer is, not necessarily. Sometimes higher benchmarks help, sometimes they do not, and sometimes the gains are unevenly distributed across producers depending on their access to buyers and contract quality. The point of this slide is not to shame anyone for buying coffee. It is to clarify that the final retail price is not a simple mirror of the farmgate outcome. Your coffee dollar is divided across a long chain, and the benchmark price is one influential signal inside that chain, not the whole story. Once you grasp that, you can ask a better question than how much should coffee cost. You can ask, which parts of the chain have the most control over pricing, and which parts absorb the most volatility when the benchmark swings. This slide adds a layer that is easy to overlook because it is not as visually obvious as a drought or a shipping delay, but it can shape outcomes just as powerfully: money itself. Coffee is traded in a global pricing environment, but producers live and pay costs locally, and that gap means currency movements can change reality even when the benchmark price does not. Here is the basic logic. A benchmark can be quoted in a dominant currency, and then the value has to be translated into local currency terms somewhere along the chain. If the local currency weakens, the benchmark can convert into more local currency on paper, which might sound helpful, but it also depends on what happens to local costs and debt, and it does not guarantee stability. If the local currency strengthens, the benchmark can convert into less local currency, which can squeeze producers even if the global benchmark is steady. So the first takeaway is that coffee pricing is not only about beans and weather. It is also about the exchange rate bridge between a global reference price and local lived costs. Now add interest rates. Why do interest rates matter in a coffee market? Because coffee is a physical product that often needs to be financed while it moves through the chain and sits in inventory. Inventory and shipping are not free. Someone is borrowing, someone is extending credit, and the cost of money influences how easy it is to hold coffee, hedge coffee, and carry positions. When interest rates rise, financing can become more expensive, which can affect inventory behavior and can also change the attractiveness of holding certain kinds of market exposure. When interest rates fall, credit conditions can loosen, which can change behavior in the opposite direction. The key point is not to claim one simple direction for every episode, because these effects interact with many other conditions. The point is that monetary conditions leak into commodity markets through credit and conversion, and that can create unintended outcomes. Policies and central decisions about money and credit, even when they are not aimed at coffee at all, can shape the incentives of firms that finance inventory, manage hedges, and negotiate contracts. So if you want a fuller picture of why coffee prices move and why producer outcomes can diverge from consumer intuition, you have to watch not only rainfall and harvests, but also the financial environment that determines how easy it is to finance, store, hedge, and translate value across currencies. For this slide, we step into a chapter of coffee history where governments and international institutions try to do something that markets struggle to do on their own during turbulent periods: stabilize prices over time. One of the most important examples in coffee is the era associated with the International Coffee Agreement, where export quotas were used as a way to limit supply reaching global markets, with the goal of reducing extreme price collapses and dampening volatility. In plain terms, the logic was simple: if too much coffee floods the market, prices crash, producers suffer, and entire regions can spiral into hardship. So a coordinated quota system tries to smooth that cycle by managing how much gets sold internationally. In some periods, arrangements like this did appear to reduce certain kinds of volatility, which is why they attracted support from producers and governments who needed predictability. But the moment you try to centrally coordinate a global commodity, you create a second economy alongside the first, the economy of rules, enforcement, negotiation, and political incentives. Quotas become valuable, and anything valuable becomes something people fight over. Countries bargain for larger shares, enforcement can be uneven, and the system can invite rent-seeking, meaning energy shifts toward winning favorable terms rather than improving productivity or resilience. You also get the classic problem of delayed adaptation. If the system cushions price signals too much or directs them through political channels, producers and governments may adjust more slowly to changing realities like shifting demand, new competitors, or evolving quality preferences. And when these stabilization systems weaken or break down, volatility can return sharply, not because coffee suddenly changed as a crop, but because the governing structure that had been smoothing the market is no longer holding. None of this means stabilization efforts were purely misguided, because the harms of volatility are real, especially for producers with thin margins and limited access to credit. It means the trade-offs are unavoidable and moral as well as economic. So the question I want you sitting with on this slide is not whether stability is good, of course it is appealing, but stability for whom, decided by whom, and paid for by whom when the coordination itself creates winners, losers, and unintended consequences. This slide is about the stories we tell ourselves when coffee prices jump, and why those stories are usually too simple to match how the system actually works. When prices spike, headlines often grab a single cause that feels intuitive, like weather, crop disease, or shipping disruptions. And to be clear, supply shocks are real. Weather events, pests, and regional production problems can absolutely tighten supply and raise uncertainty. But the point of this slide is that the path from a shock to the price you hear about is not a straight line. It is a chain of translation, and each link in that chain matters. First, an event happens or is expected to happen. Then expectations form. Traders, firms, and market participants ask, how bad could this be, how long could it last, and what does it mean for future availability? Those expectations can move the futures price quickly, because futures markets are built to price the future and to react in real time to uncertainty. Then that futures price influences benchmark referenced contracts, shaping how physical deals are quoted and negotiated. Finally, those contract outcomes ripple through the supply chain and show up in different ways at the farmgate level and the retail level, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, and often unevenly. This is why you can have a situation where the physical coffee is still in warehouses or still growing, yet the quoted market price moves sharply. The price is not only reflecting what exists today, it is reflecting what the market believes may exist later, and how willing participants are to carry risk right now. And this is also why media narratives can miss the bigger picture. A headline might say prices rise because of drought, but the market response includes layers like inventory behavior, contract timing, currency shifts, and financial positioning. So when you hear a single cause offered as the explanation, it is worth asking, is that the trigger, or is that the full mechanism? This slide is training your eye to see the multi-step pathway instead of a one-sentence story, because once you see the pathway, you start to understand why the same shock can affect farmers differently depending on when they sell, what contracts they have, and how the benchmark is moving at that moment, and why consumers might experience price changes that feel disconnected from what producers experience on the ground. This slide is where we take everything we have learned so far and ask a practical question: if benchmarks can concentrate pricing power and volatility can land hardest on the least protected participants, what actually expands agency in the real world without pretending uncertainty can be eliminated? The first answer is collective strength. Producer cooperatives can pool resources, share expertise, and sometimes access tools that are difficult for an individual farmer to use effectively. That might mean shared risk management, shared financing, shared storage, or simply better bargaining leverage. The point is not that cooperatives are perfect. The point is that scale changes your options, and voluntary coordination can increase negotiating power without requiring a single centralized authority to dictate outcomes. A second tool is long-term contracting. Instead of living entirely at the mercy of short-term price swings, longer-term agreements can create more predictable income and more predictable supply planning. That predictability can encourage investment in quality, infrastructure, and sustainability, because people are not constantly trying to survive the next price shock. Alongside this is transparency. When pricing is more transparent, when the basis for a deal is clearer, and when information is less asymmetric, the weakest party is less likely to be trapped in a take-it-or-leave-it moment. Now, many people hear direct trade and assume it is the silver bullet. Direct relationships between buyers and producers can improve incentives and can reward quality and reliability in ways a benchmark alone cannot. But this slide is careful for a reason. Direct trade cannot replace benchmarks at scale for the entire world. The global market is too large, and coordination problems are real. So the more realistic point is that direct trade and similar models can coexist with benchmarks and improve outcomes where relationships and transparency are strong. And finally, this slide gestures toward emerging tools that are less about ideology and more about design. Better price transparency systems, digital contracting, and finance that is actually built around producer needs can reduce the gap between who can manage risk and who cannot. If financial access and knowledge barriers shrink, then the benefits of risk management are not reserved for only the biggest players. So the takeaway here is grounded and practical. Agency expands when people can coordinate voluntarily, negotiate with clearer information, and access tools that let them share risk rather than simply absorb it. And if you want a single question to sit with as we move toward the close, it is this. What would it look like for a global price system to remain efficient while making risk-sharing and bargaining power less dependent on size and institutional privilege? In our final slide, we come back to the title and finally say what the phrase true cost really means in this story. The true cost of your coffee is not only what you pay at the counter. It includes the invisible architecture that turns a crop grown in specific soils by specific people into a globally coordinated price, and it includes how that architecture distributes volatility, bargaining power, and risk. Futures markets and benchmarks can be socially useful because they coordinate trade and allow planning, but they can also create distance between a price signal and lived reality, especially for producers who have the least ability to buffer shocks. So if you take nothing else away, take this: a coffee price is not just a number. It is the output of a system, and systems always embed choices about who carries uncertainty and who gets stability. That is why the slide ends with 3 questions, because questions are often the most honest conclusion. First, who bears volatility in this system, in practice, not in theory? Second, which institutions or arrangements actually help those people manage volatility, rather than simply endure it? And third, what would a more voluntary, transparent risk-sharing model look like at scale, where coordination remains possible but agency is expanded? If you can answer those 3 questions, even partially, you will never look at your morning coffee the same way again, because you will be seeing the hidden mechanics behind the label and the latte art. If you enjoyed this breakdown, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Here is my question for you. Do you think the current coffee pricing system shares risk fairly, or does it quietly push volatility onto the people least able to carry it?